Hi, Wilf. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today in our very first podcast for the TWP Community of Practice newsletter of the November edition. And I am really excited to speak with you because I know that you have been a pioneer in all things TWP, in a lot of the work that you have done with DFID back in the day, also FCDO, and now with a project supported by USAID in Zambia. So this is very exciting, and we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on all things TWP, as we would say. So let me start with the first question for you, which is, can you tell us a little bit about how you started your TWP journey? How is it that
Sure.
you came to think about the centrality of politics in development? And what has been helpful in enabling you to do that, to think about the politics of development and act accordingly?
Good. Thanks very much, Lina, for having me, and really happy to be here too. Well, I think basically my career in development, I started as a community mobilizer, working on a community-based project, mobilizing communities to build schools, community schools. So I would go into communities and help, raise awareness in the community, get parents to support the building of schools for their children. And very early in that process, I realized that everything, no matter how innocent it may be, revolved around politics. It's either we were stopped by a local councillor, or political parties wanted to know which side of the divide we were supporting with the work that we were doing. So I was quite clear from very early on that politics would be at the center of anything that we did. However, joining DFID during the age of drivers of change was
Mhm.
probably the game changer for me. It gave me the framework to think through, systematically think through the role of politics in development. And I was very privileged to work with people like Graham Teskey, who at the time was the head of the governance profession in DFID. So I would say, the having an enabling environment with people who had this experience and who were already exposed to thinking and working politically, although it wasn't called that then, really helped me to get, to understand how you turn the knowledge about local politics and context into something that's productive and helps to take development outcomes forward. So I think that would be my introduction to thinking and working politically.
Thank you so much, Wilf. And it's really interesting to hear that you actually were working closely with Graham Teskey back in the day. It has been about 2 decades, really, since DFID in particular, as well as other developing organizations, have been trying to think about development differently and work differently on the ground as a result. And I'm wondering, could you give us an example of where you have been able to see or witness TWP in action on the ground, and what kind of role you may have played in enabling or facilitating that?
Sure, thank you. I think there are a number of examples, but let me pick two. One very quick one, and one I'll explain a bit more. I think, working in Nigeria for me was very eye opening. I had spent most of my work life when I started in Zambia, in my own country. And so I took things for granted because when we were stuck, I knew who to call, where to, press the button, if you like. Whereas going into a place like Nigeria, where I had to learn what the context was, sorry, meant I needed to really think and work politically. We were working, I was leading a project from the DFID end called SAVI, the State Accountability and Voice Initiative, which worked across 10 different states with very different nuances in terms of context. Some of the leaders, some of the governors we had in those states were reformists, most were not. They were, their incentives to be putting it politely, were elsewhere. So that was a very it was eye opening for me to just see how important it was to understand the context, to really know the players, start to understand the incentives. And as I said, having come from a country where this was home, I took those things for granted. Working in Nigeria, where I had to start from scratch to learn about the context, really helped me to put much more importance on the frameworks for learning for political economy analysis. And my main role when I was working on Savi was to be the enabler, making sure that I could create space for the program within DFID at the time to be able to do that. However, I think one example that I'm really proud of, this is much more recent than my work in Nigeria, was when I was working in DRC. DRC had, delayed its election for a long time, and they finally held it in December 2018. And I felt like for the 2 years before then, where I went to Nigeria in 2016, and I dedicated most of my life trying to work with stakeholders to push or to nudge, the political establishment towards holding the long delayed elections. And ahead of the elections, DRC government decided to introduce what they called voter machines. And technically, the reason for bringing in voter machines was logical, because they would have so many candidates. The ballot paper would be sometimes run into hundreds of pages. So they thought by bringing in these machines, they would reduce the logistical problem that they had, and enable people to more easily cast their vote. However, they introduced this without any consultation at all with stakeholders, which brought suspicion. And the opposition threatened to boycott the election. The influential Catholic Church was opposed to it. And because these two groups were opposed to it, it meant, they influenced citizens against the use of these machines. But we also knew, understanding the politics, that the government had decided, and giving them any excuse at all to cancel the election, they would grab it. And so we had to find a way of working with these challenges to help the process move forward. So we decided to think we internally about the technical tools we had in terms of being able to bring in technical expertise, and also some of the political goodwill we had with, working with our colleagues in the Foreign Commonwealth Office then, our political officers and the ambassador, to be able to convince stakeholders. We thought, let's use a technical solution to start, and that was to bring in an independent team to just come and have a review of these machines in order to help have a constructive discussion around the machines. So the machines themselves may, in the end, were largely neutral. I mean, they could be manipulated, but through the review, we found there were a few problems with them, but those could be sorted. However, what the report did was enable us to then use the findings of that report to show the pros and cons of using these machines, take the debate to a level where it was less about emotion and really looking at the machines and seeing whether there were ways you could, factor in certain controls that would enable the stakeholder fears to be allayed. And so, having got them the report, we put our ambassador, the UK ambassador in DRC, then to use, and used his office's ability to convince stakeholders and to influence at a very high level the presidency, the president of the Electoral Commission in Nigeria, in DRC, to push them towards having a consultative meeting with all stakeholders, at which the group that we had brought in to do the review presented. And we had several hundreds of people at that presentation, which really helped to facilitate dialogue around the contentious issues of the machine. Now, this was the first time that this dialogue took place. And although we started with a technical solution, what we really did was encourage a political solution of a compromise and discussion. We didn't get the first meeting went relatively well, but we didn't know whether that would help to take the process further. And we continued in the background talking to different stakeholders, sharing their results, responding to their questions. And I think in the end, we did have an election. The result of that election and what happened after that is a story for another day. However, in that case, my role was really to work in the background, thinking through all the tools that we had, and realizing that as a donor, having working for DFID, we really couldn't be the ones seen to be in the forefront. Therefore, we brought someone independent to help do carry out this review, and our role was in the background to encourage that consensus building, bringing players together. So I think in that role, as challenging as it was, my most effective intervention was not existing publicly while doing quite a lot in the background to bring the relevant players together. So that for me was one example where we really used the strength of both FCO and DFID and other stakeholders to get a result that really mattered for DRC.
Wilf, that's a really interesting example, and thank you so much for sharing it. I don't think I have heard of that story in particular, so it really brings to life a lot of what we think about when we think about thinking, working politically, and perhaps using a technical in to deal with issues that are profoundly political in nature, but in ways that might be smarter, and convening, as you say, different stakeholders who may otherwise not be coming together. So that's really valuable. I wonder if you could tell us from that experience, how did you feel that you were able to do this within DFID at the time? What kind of space or enabling environment did you find that you had to be able to make the decisions that you were making at the level that you were making them, to continue to push on this in a way that you felt was tailored to the local context?
Sure. I mean, it wasn't easy. We had sometimes differences between DFID and FCO in the way we saw the world, but we focused first on the things we agreed on. We agreed that DRC needed to have an election. And we also agreed that each one of our organizations had the strength, and so rather than fighting each other, even where we didn't disagree, we always started with looking at areas where we were agreeing, and building consensus internally first, helping for lack of a better word, educate our seniors about the importance of thinking politics for DRC, not just for the UK or the relationship between the UK and DRC. Helping them understand that for some of this work, we were all going to have to be invisible, playing that invisible hand, convening the stakeholders, and there were not going to be many photo opportunities with this kind of work. I think personally, I also had a very good relationship with my head of office and the seniors, the ambassador, that we could honestly talk and debate, agree to disagree sometimes, but I needed to understand what their incentives were, some of their fears, and the more I understood that and found ways of allaying them, the more they left us space to operate as a team. So I think it's really important to think about those with authority above you. We also involved the ministers in the UK in doing all of this. So, for example, to get cover for getting this technical work going, we wrote to the minister and said, Minister, these are the options that are there. This could go wrong. If the report is seen as the UK, for example, endorsing these machines, it could go very wrong, which is why we also want to do this work at arm's length. But this is the honest opinions of your technocrats. And these are the risks. We laid them out to him, and he gave us conditions at the time on what were his red lines, and we just made sure that we kept that at the back of our minds as we went through this work. So, and I think we really just had a very good team in DRC with my team of governance advisors, the political team in FCO. We worked together well and had built strong relationships with counterparts in the Congolese government and Congolese stakeholders, that they knew our hearts and minds were in the right place, even though we may not have had all the answers. Hopefully that helps to give you a flavor of what it was like inside.
Yes, absolutely. And that also, what you're saying helps to highlight some of the things that we have been finding across the TWP space about the need to develop relationships that are very much based on trust, the ability and the backing to take risks, and how you do that. And it sounds like you have provided a very good example of how you actually did take a risk and sought to get support to be able to do that. So I think you have brought this example very, very nicely to life in relation to TWP. And I'm wondering, based a little bit on all of this work that you have done, both with DFID and FCDO, as well as USAID now, and obviously with partners on the ground, where do you think international development actors are now in terms of TWP? Where has TWP gotten most traction, and why do you think that is?
I think, first of all, I think there's a general acceptance across most of the major donors now about the centrality of politics. I think that's a good thing. When the World Bank writes a World Development Report and puts governance at the center of it, when they, put resources to writing their own political economy analysis tools, you see that the world has moved. And that's a good thing, because that's a big machinery, and they probably are usually slower to move on these things. So I think there's a general acceptance across donors that, or cooperating partners, as we call them, that politics is central to everything that we do. So they're investing in understanding the context. They're investing in providing the tools for doing that. DFID has always been, from the time I joined, quite a leader on this. And I look at USAID now, and I've had to learn their own framework for political economy analysis, working on a project. I believe you probably produced one of their papers that I've been reading, right? The Thinking and Working Politically. Is it in practice or applied working?
It has a very long time. I think it's called
Yes.
Thinking and Working Politically Through Applied Political Economy Analysis. Yes,
Exactly.
that's the framework.
Yes.
And yes, I was one of the lead writers, and then we had that very short document and lots of annexes. So I expect that you've read everything.
I have read a lot of them, yes. But for me, coming into a new organization, and that's one of the first documents they give you, shows the prominence that thinking and working politically has taken. So I think it's probably been brought about by the many failures that we've had, as well as development practitioners. There's a lot of money that's been thrown at problems, and we normally are very good at solving issues which are direct. Putting kids in schools, and we can do all of that, but sustaining that, we don't have a very good history. And I think people have woken up to the fact that at the center, the reason for that is really around politics, and donors understand that. I think there's also kind of a humility that donors, because of that, there's been a development of a humility, and that you don't come with expertise from outside that you can just cut and paste, that you've got to contextualize whatever solutions you have. And so that has also driven the acceptance and the embracing of thinking and working politically by many donors. I must say, before I went to Nigeria, for example, I had never worked with a service provider or an implementing partner. I came from a country where DFID was supporting a government through government-to-government relations, through budget support, and so on. Going to a place like Nigeria, where I then had an encounter with international development consultancy firms, showed me what role they've also played in all of this. I think they've brought some of that expertise that we may not have had, or brought some of the freedom that internally as donors we didn't always have in thinking and working politically. So I think generally what we've done well is that acceptance, and that this is now driving a lot of our of interventions. There are things that we haven't done well, and maybe we might discuss that later. But in terms of what we've done now, that acceptance and investing in the tools, investing in people, respecting local expertise, that's something that I think we're getting better at doing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that's exactly right. And in fact, my next question for you was around that. Where is there more work that is needed in TWP and uptake, do you think?
Sure. So, from my perspective, I think two or three things. The first one is, I think there's still a hang up on the tools rather than on actually really going back to the USAID paper, uh, applying political economy analysis and thinking and working politically. So you find that we spend so much time perfecting reports. We want the best consultants to come. We want, we want Alina, we want Graham and Davies of this world to come and write these reports, which is a good thing. The reports are good, but that in itself does not lead immediately into thinking and working politically. So I think we need to loosen up sometimes on the tools. If I use a combination of tools from DFID, World Bank, USAID to get to understand the context and use it, then we will be doing political economy analysis. And I think programs that do that well focus more about on the substance rather than the form. So I think that's something that we all need to learn from. The second thing is the applied bit, right? So we can sometimes end up using these as academic reports. We use them when we're designing a project, but once a project starts going, it's hard to adapt, partly because of the incentives within the donor community. It's so hard to change business cases in DFID. It probably is the same with USAID once the contracts are signed. So there's still some learning, some work to be done on how we actually adapt and make sure that the analysis is leading to change in the way we do things and in the way we do our programming. So I think, and the last thing is around measuring of results, because what we measure is what takes prominence. So if we're measuring results that affect the bottom line, or affect payment by results, which is the new drive, we end up missing the opportunities to actually really work on those some long-term things that will fundamentally make a difference. So I think there's less focus on the tools, more on application. We need to think a bit more about using the analysis to change and adapt our programs. And then finally, we need to find new ways of measuring progress rather than just the easy stuff.
Yes, and I think this is the last point that you make is actually something that the Nats wrote an article now, I think more than a decade ago. He was the chief administrator for USAID, and he was saying that part of the challenge is precisely that if we have a focus on measuring things that are obvious and immediate and easy, that keeps that bean counting, and it takes away the focus on the bigger picture and on things that may be less tangible but perhaps much more fundamental, right? So he was talking about that challenge, and I think the different things that you have highlighted around payment by results and the pressures to produce towards that goal can in a way undermine thinking, working politically, and ways of working that are more based on on progress, if you will, or process, than in immediate outcomes like that. So I think that that's very important. Thank you so much. I wonder, Wilf, if for closing, you could share with us, if you were to bestow a piece of advice on fellow travelers on this TWP road, what would it be? What kinds of words of wisdom would you share with them, or what would you recommend that they read or learn more about? Oh, thank
So
you.
whether it's words of wisdom or just I won't call them words of wisdom, but this is what I think. Sometimes it's easy in development. I found that myself to get hung up with words or with the what do you call it, the new phrases. A lot of this stuff is common sense. A lot of this stuff is your instincts. A lot of this stuff is actually living in the experience, really getting to know your context, really embracing it, and really having the passion to learn about the people, about the country. That's the starting point. All the frameworks that we then use help us to organize that. That's organized knowledge. But I think starting from very much embracing the country, embracing the people, embracing the cultures really helps us to understand. And I think that's one. And I think leaving behind our own judgments. I don't always understand, what the what the cultures in the UK is. You will never always understand what the cultures in Africa, as example, or Zambia in particular are. But we've got to respect that, and I think for me those are fundamental. Once you do that, then the intellectual stuff becomes easier. This is about people. This is about communities, and this is about cultures. And my final word would be: please make sure to know the difference between thinking and working politically versus thinking and working patronizingly. Sometimes, because we have a bit of a knowledge of a country, we've read some books, we can all feel that we know enough. Sometimes it's amusing when people call themselves an expert on Africa or a region, because they've studied the region. It's very different studying it versus living it. So I think it's really just making sure that we're always having the humility to know that learning is ongoing. And the more we know, the more we know we don't know.
Will, that's a really excellent note to end on, and I very much take to heart your advice that we should be very humble, because this is all about learning. And as you say, the more we delve into things, the more we realize that they're quite complex and that we just may not know enough. So this has been really wonderful. I hope we can continue with podcasts or different ways of experimenting with bringing voices of around TWP to the newsletter. And thank you so much for being our very first guest in this endeavor.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.